The hardest working people are often the ones the world never notices. The city bus hummed through the rain-soaked streets of downtown Chicago just after 9:40 p.m., its tired engine blending with the steady hiss of water against the windows. Fluorescent lights flickered softly overhead, washing every face in the same pale glow, but almost no one looked up anymore. After another long workday, strangers stared at their phones, rested their foreheads against the glass, or silently counted the stops until home. Near the back sat Claire Bennett, a 28-year-old single mother whose body had quietly surrendered to exhaustion long before her mind had given permission. Her head leaned against the cold window, rising slightly each time the bus rolled over another crack in the pavement. A faded gray hoodie covered the navy polo shirt from her first job, while a green grocery apron was folded carefully inside her worn backpack, ready for tomorrow's evening shift. Her sneakers were still damp from walking 3 blocks through the rain after clocking out, and tiny drops of water clung to loose strands of blonde hair that framed a face far younger than the burden it carried. Resting loosely in her lap was a small paper folder she hadn't even realized she was still holding. Its edges were softened from being folded and unfolded too many times during too many late nights. Inside were 2 payroll stubs, each printed only hours apart, each representing another week of trading sleep for survival. The bus rocked gently, and one corner of the folder slipped lower as her fingers relaxed. Across the aisle, a man wearing a dark charcoal jacket glanced up from the financial report displayed on his tablet. Ethan Brooks had boarded only 4 stops earlier after leaving an investment meeting that had stretched longer than expected. At 39, he had spent years building one of the country's fastest-growing investment firms. Yet tonight he had chosen the city bus instead of waiting for his driver. He often did things that confused people whenever he wanted to remember what life looked like outside boardrooms and glass towers. His attention lingered on the sleeping woman for reasons he couldn't immediately explain. It wasn't pity. It wasn't curiosity. It was the unmistakable look of someone who had simply reached the end of what a human body could give. Every few seconds her shoulders twitched slightly, as though she were still trying to keep working even in her dreams. The automated speaker crackled overhead. Final stop. Everyone must exit the bus. Most passengers gathered their bags without a word and shuffled toward the doors. Claire never moved. The driver glanced into the rearview mirror before switching off the interior lights, clearly assuming the remaining passenger would wake on her own. Ethan remained seated for another moment, watching as the nearly empty bus settled into silence broken only by rain tapping softly against the roof. Then he stood, walked down the aisle, and stopped beside her seat. He kept his voice low enough not to startle her. "Ma'am, we're at the last stop." Claire's eyes opened suddenly, confusion replacing sleep in an instant. She straightened so quickly that the folder slipped from her lap. 2 payroll stubs fluttered onto the rubber floor between them. Ethan instinctively bent down to pick them up, but before he could hand them back, one detail caught his eye. 89 hours on one paycheck, 36 on the other, both earned in the very same week. Claire's face flushed with embarrassment as she quickly reached for the papers, but Ethan had already picked them up with careful hands. He did not read beyond the numbers that had accidentally caught his attention. Instead, he offered the payroll stubs back as though they were something fragile. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I did not mean to look." Claire accepted them almost immediately, pressing them against her chest before sliding them back into the folder. "It is okay," she replied, forcing a tired smile that barely reached her blue eyes. "It is not exactly a secret. I just usually do not fall asleep in front of strangers." Ethan noticed how her voice carried more apology than self-pity, as if she felt responsible for inconveniencing the entire world simply because she had been too exhausted to stay awake. The bus driver stepped toward the aisle and gave them an understanding smile. "Long week?" he asked. Claire laughed softly, the kind of laugh that sounded more like surrender than amusement. "Something like that." The driver nodded before climbing down from the bus, giving the last 2 passengers a moment to gather themselves while the rain continued falling outside. Claire slipped one backpack strap over her shoulder and checked her phone. The brightness from the screen reflected instantly in her worried expression. 3 missed calls, 2 text messages, 1 voicemail notification. Her heart skipped. She tapped the latest message without saying a word. "Hi, Claire. An older woman's voice said through the speaker. Lily is asleep. Do not rush. She kept asking if Mommy was still helping people at work. I told her yes. Drive safely whenever you get here. Claire closed her eyes for one brief second before locking the screen again. Relief washed across her face, quickly followed by guilt. Ethan pretended not to notice, offering her enough privacy to put the phone away before speaking. Your daughter? Claire nodded. She is 5. Her smile became real for the first time. She thinks every grown-up goes to work just to help people. Ethan smiled back. That is not a bad way to see the world. Claire adjusted the backpack on her shoulder. I try not to correct her yet. They stepped off the bus into the cool night air. Rain drifted gently beneath the streetlights, turning the pavement into ribbons of reflected gold. Claire looked around the empty terminal, and her shoulders immediately tightened. The digital schedule above the shelter flashed a message she had been hoping not to see. Last route departed. No additional service tonight. She whispered something under her breath before checking a rideshare application on her phone. The price appearing on the screen made her quietly shake her head. It was almost $48 because of the weather, more than she earned in nearly 3 hours at the grocery store. She slipped the phone back into her pocket as though refusing to look at it could somehow change the number. Ethan understood without asking. Do you have someone who can pick you up? He asked. Claire smiled politely. No, I will figure something out. Her answer came too quickly, practiced from years of saying the same words whenever life became more difficult than she wanted anyone else to know. She looked down the nearly empty street, calculating distances instead of complaining. Home was over 6 miles away, and tomorrow morning's alarm would ring in less than 6 hours. Yet even then, she squared her shoulders and prepared to start walking. Claire tightened her grip on the backpack strap and stepped toward the sidewalk before Ethan spoke again. Please wait. She turned politely, already prepared to decline whatever kindness he was about to offer. I can call a ride for you, he said. It is still raining, and 6 miles is a long walk after a day like yours. Claire smiled with genuine appreciation, but she shook her head almost immediately. Thank you, but I cannot let you do that. Ethan slipped his phone back into his pocket without insisting. Why not? She hesitated, searching for words that would not sound ungrateful. Because if I accept help every time life gets difficult, I might stop believing I can handle it myself. Ethan studied her expression. There was no pride in her answer, only quiet determination. It sounded less like a philosophy and more like a promise she had made to herself years ago. The rain grew heavier, tapping softly against the metal bus shelter. Claire pulled the hood of her sweatshirt over her damp hair and looked toward the empty street again. Besides, she added with a faint smile, my daughter is watching how I solve problems, even when she cannot actually see me. Ethan found himself unexpectedly moved by the sentence. In boardrooms, he had listened to executives deliver speeches about leadership worth millions of dollars in consulting fees. Yet this exhausted woman had just said something wiser in less than 10 seconds. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance before slowing beside the curb. A taxi had just dropped off another passenger and was about to pull away. Ethan raised his hand instinctively, signaling the driver before Claire even realized what had happened. The driver rolled down the window. Need a ride? Ethan stepped closer. Can you take her to the Westridge Apartments? The driver nodded. Sure can. Claire immediately reached into her backpack and pulled out her worn wallet. She counted the bills inside once, then counted them again, her fingers slowing after the second time. Ethan noticed the calculation happening behind her eyes. Rent, groceries, childcare, tomorrow's lunch, gas money she no longer needed because she had sold her old car months ago. Every dollar already belonged somewhere else. Before Claire could say anything, Ethan quietly handed the driver several folded bills through the open window. That should cover everything, he said. Claire's eyes widened. No, please. I told you I cannot. Ethan met her gaze calmly. You are not accepting money from me. She looked confused. Then what is this? A stranger saw another stranger standing in the rain after midnight. That is all. Claire stood silent for a moment. I do not even know your name. Ethan. Thank you, Ethan. He smiled gently. You are welcome, Claire. She froze. How do you know my name? Ethan pointed toward the payroll stub that still peeked slightly from her folder before looking away immediately. It was printed there. I could not help noticing when I picked it up. Claire relaxed and laughed softly at herself. Right. I forgot about that. She climbed into the back seat, still uncertain whether she should feel embarrassed or grateful. Before closing the door, she looked back at him one last time. I hope somebody shows you kindness when you need it someday. Ethan nodded without answering. The taxi disappeared into the rainy streets, its red taillights fading one block at a time until they vanished completely. Ethan remained standing beneath the bus shelter long after the road had emptied again. He could not explain why 2 payroll stubs, a tired smile, and one simple sentence about a little girl had stayed with him more powerfully than any business presentation he had heard all week. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale sunlight that reflected off rain-soaked sidewalks, making the city appear cleaner than it truly was. Chicago woke. With its usual urgency, coffee shops filled before sunrise. Office buildings swallowed thousands of commuters. Delivery trucks crowded the streets. For Claire Bennett, however, the new day had started at 5 o'clock with the familiar sound of a small alarm clock and an even smaller voice asking, "Mommy, is today a school day?" She smiled before opening her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart." Lily sat cross-legged on the couch eating oatmeal, while proudly explaining how she had remembered to pack her favorite blue crayon without being reminded. Claire listened with complete attention even as she packed a simple lunch, folded clean laundry, and mentally organized the next 16 hours of her day. There was never enough time, but Lily never needed to know that. By 8:30, Claire had already dropped her daughter at kindergarten and completed the morning shift at the neighborhood bakery before changing into the green apron of the grocery store where she worked evenings. During her lunch break, she stopped at a small neighborhood supermarket, hoping to stretch every remaining dollar until Friday's paycheck arrived. She pushed an aging shopping cart slowly through the aisles, comparing prices instead of brands. Every purchase required a quiet calculation. Milk or orange juice, fresh strawberries or bananas, whole grain bread or the one on clearance. Her phone calculator appeared almost as often as her shopping list. At the opposite end of the same store, Ethan Brooks adjusted the sleeves of a simple navy jacket while carrying only a small basket. Nobody looked at him twice. Without the tailored suits, private driver, and executive assistants, he blended into the afternoon crowd like any other customer. After the previous night, he had found himself thinking about Claire far more than he expected. Not because she had asked for anything. She had not. In fact, she had done everything possible to refuse help. That quiet dignity had stayed with him. As he reached for a carton of eggs, he noticed a familiar gray hoodie several aisles away. Claire stood in front of the dairy case, studying 2 nearly identical containers of yogurt. One cost 40 cents less because it expired 2 days sooner. She read both labels carefully before choosing the cheaper one with a satisfied nod, as though she had solved an important puzzle. Ethan watched from a respectful distance without interrupting. He noticed something else moments later. An elderly man standing nearby accidentally dropped a package of canned soup while trying to reach the top shelf. Before any employee could respond, Claire quietly parked her cart, picked up every can, and helped him place them back inside his basket. She smiled warmly when he apologized for taking her time. "You did not," she said. "We all need a little help once in a while." The words lingered with Ethan. They were spoken by the same woman who had refused help for herself less than 12 hours earlier. As Claire continued shopping, she never realized the man from the bus was only 1 aisle away. Ethan found himself smiling for reasons that had nothing to do with business. He had spent years evaluating companies by numbers, forecasts, and quarterly reports. Yet here stood a woman whose greatest wealth could not be measured on any financial statement. She carried kindness as naturally as breathing, even when every dollar and every minute of her own life had already been spoken for. That evening, after returning to his office overlooking the Chicago River, Ethan stood quietly beside the floor-to-ceiling windows as the city lights slowly replaced the fading sunset. His executive suite occupied the top floor of Brooks Capital, where every decision was usually measured in percentages, projections, and market value. Yet for the first time in weeks, none of the reports spread across his desk held his attention. His thoughts kept returning to a woman who compared yogurt prices, thanked strangers with sincere smiles, and apologized for falling asleep because she had worked herself beyond exhaustion. He walked back to his desk and pressed the intercom. "Megan, do you have a minute?" Within seconds, his executive assistant entered carrying a tablet. She had worked beside Ethan for nearly 8 years and had learned to recognize the difference between business questions and personal curiosity. Tonight, this was neither. "What do you need?" she asked. Ethan hesitated for a brief moment before answering. "I would like you to look into someone." Megan raised an eyebrow. "A potential employee?" "Maybe." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Her name is Claire Bennett." Megan opened a search window immediately. "Do you have anything else?" Ethan nodded. "She works 2 jobs. One of them is a grocery store. I believe the other is a neighborhood bakery. She has a young daughter." Megan typed quietly before stopping. "There are several people with that name." Ethan remembered the payroll stub from the night before. "West Ridge area. I believe that is where she lives." A few moments later, one profile appeared among local employment records that matched the information. Megan looked surprised. "Interesting." Ethan glanced up. "What?" "She worked somewhere familiar about 3 years ago." Ethan accepted the tablet. The company name immediately caught his attention. North Harbor Financial Services. Brooks Capital had acquired the struggling accounting firm 4 years earlier, restructuring most of its operations before merging departments into another subsidiary. Ethan frowned slightly. Why did she leave? Megan continued searching through archived employment files that were publicly available. There is no disciplinary record. No complaints. Her performance reviews were consistently excellent. She paused before opening another document. She resigned voluntarily 6 weeks after taking family medical leave. Ethan remained silent. Family medical leave? Megan nodded. According to this summary, her mother experienced a serious illness. Claire requested flexible scheduling, but the department could not accommodate it because of staffing shortages during the transition after the acquisition. Ethan slowly placed the tablet on his desk. He remembered those months well. Thousands of files had crossed his desk. Budgets, contracts, department reorganizations. He had approved broad policies without ever seeing the names of individual employees affected by them. Claire Bennett had been one of those names. Not because anyone intended to harm her, but because corporations often reduced human stories to numbers inside spreadsheets. Megan continued reading. After resigning, she accepted hourly positions instead of returning to corporate accounting. It looks like she has been working multiple jobs ever since. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the city below. Somewhere among millions of lights, Claire was probably beginning another evening shift while helping Lily with homework between breaks or wondering whether the groceries she had purchased would last until the weekend. He finally spoke in a calm voice. "Do not contact her." Megan looked surprised again. "Not yet." Ethan shook his head. "If I help her because I feel guilty, I will only be helping myself. I want to know who she is before I decide whether there is a place for her in this company." Megan quietly nodded and left the office. Ethan remained alone, staring once more through the glass. For years he had believed success meant building bigger companies. Tonight, for the first time, he wondered whether success also meant noticing the people who quietly carried those companies on their shoulders without anyone ever learning their names. The following Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and cool air that carried the first hint of fall through the neighborhood. Claire had promised Lily they would walk to the public library before her afternoon shift, and promises were the one thing she never allowed life to break. Lily skipped happily beside her, holding a small canvas tote almost as big as she was. "Do you think they still have the dinosaur book?" she asked. Claire smiled. "If they do not, we will find another adventure." They spent nearly an hour inside the quiet building, where Lily carefully selected picture books, while Claire wandered toward the community bulletin board near the entrance. Between advertisements for piano lessons and neighborhood yard sales, one flyer caught her attention. It announced free evening accounting certification classes sponsored by a local business foundation. Her fingers rested on the paper a little longer than necessary before she copied the registration information into her phone. She had nearly forgotten what it felt like to hope for something beyond surviving the next paycheck. Across town, Ethan sat inside a neighborhood coffee shop instead of the private club where many executives spent their weekends. Through the front window, he watched ordinary families passing by, and he found himself wondering how Claire managed to keep smiling while carrying responsibilities that would overwhelm most people. His thoughts were interrupted when Megan called. "I found something else," she said. Ethan listened quietly. Claire enrolled in online accounting courses almost 2 years ago. She has completed every class with excellent grades. Ethan leaned forward. Then why is she still working hourly jobs? Megan answered softly. Because she only studies after her daughter goes to sleep. She has not been able to afford the certification exam fee. Ethan remained silent again. The amount required for the exam was less than many executives spent on lunch during a single meeting. Yet for Claire, it represented another mountain to climb. Later that afternoon, Ethan decided to visit the grocery store where Claire worked, not as a customer searching for answers, but as an observer hoping to understand the person behind the paperwork. He filled a small basket with everyday items before joining the checkout line, where Claire greeted each customer with the same warm expression she had offered the elderly man days earlier. Even after hours on her feet, she remembered regular customers by name, asked about their families, and thanked every person as though they had done her a favor by shopping there. A young mother entered the line carrying a restless toddler while struggling to unload groceries onto the conveyor belt. Without hesitation, Claire stepped around the register, knelt beside the shopping cart, and handed the little boy a clean paper grocery bag folded into the shape of a simple hat. The child laughed instantly, proudly placing it on his head while his mother finished unloading the cart. "You have magic hands," the woman said with a grateful smile. Claire laughed gently. "No, I just remember what it feels like to shop with a tired little one." Ethan watched the entire moment without saying a word. There was no audience applauding her kindness, no manager evaluating her performance, no camera recording the gesture. She acted the same way when nobody important was watching. As he reached the register, Claire looked up and recognized him immediately. Surprise crossed her face before softening into a genuine smile. "Well," she said warmly, "it looks like the city is smaller than I thought." Ethan returned the smile. "Or perhaps kind people are easier to find than we realize." Claire laughed quietly while scanning the groceries. Neither of them realized that this ordinary conversation would soon become the beginning of a completely different future. After paying for his groceries, Ethan thanked Claire and walked toward the parking lot, but he did not start his car right away. Instead, he sat quietly behind the steering wheel, watching customers come and go through the wide glass windows of the store. Inside, Claire moved from one register to another without slowing down, greeting each person with the same patient smile. She never looked at the clock unless another employee reminded her it was time for a break. Even then, she chose to help bag groceries for an older cashier whose hands had begun to ache after a long shift. Ethan found himself asking a question he had never considered during all his years as a chief executive. How many remarkable people had he overlooked simply because they had never stood inside a conference room? Late that evening, after the store had closed, Claire untied her green apron and folded it neatly into her backpack before heading toward the employee exit. One of her younger coworkers struggled to carry 2 heavy boxes of canned goods back into the storage room after a delivery had arrived late. Claire stopped without hesitation. "Go home," she told him with a gentle smile. "Your mother is waiting for you. I can finish this." "You have already worked all day," the young man protested. Claire shrugged lightly. "So have you." Together they finished the task in only a few minutes, but she insisted he leave first. From across the parking lot, Ethan had witnessed the entire exchange while waiting for a call to finish. She had no idea anyone was watching, yet she still chose someone else's family over a few extra minutes of her own time. As Claire finally stepped outside, she looked up at the evening sky and smiled softly when she saw the rain had stopped. She began the familiar walk toward the nearby bus stop, her backpack resting heavily against tired shoulders. Ethan remained where he was until she disappeared around the corner. The following Monday morning, Brooks Capital held its weekly executive meeting inside a polished conference room overlooking the skyline. Department heads discussed acquisitions, staffing forecasts, and expansion plans while digital charts filled the large display screen. Ethan listened quietly before interrupting the presentation with an unexpected question. "How many positions do we currently have open in accounting across all subsidiaries?" The room fell silent for a moment before the human resources director answered. 32, although several require updated certifications. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "And how often do we overlook candidates because they took unconventional career paths?" No one answered immediately. Finally, one executive admitted, "Probably more often than we realize." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Then perhaps we should start looking for character before we only look for perfect resumes." Several people exchanged curious glances, uncertain what had inspired the sudden change in perspective. Ethan offered no further explanation. That afternoon, Megan entered his office carrying a thin folder. "Claire Bennett registered for the accounting certification exam this morning," she said with a smile. Ethan looked up. "She found the community scholarship program?" Megan nodded. "Yes. One of the nonprofit organizations we sponsor posted the opportunity at several public libraries last week." Ethan smiled quietly. He had not arranged it for her. She had discovered it on her own. Somehow that made the news even more satisfying. He closed the folder without opening it. For the first time in many years, he realized that real strength was not measured by the size of a company someone built. Sometimes it could be found in a single mother who refused to stop learning, refused to stop working, and refused to let her daughter believe that hope was ever something only wealthy people could afford. 3 months passed more quickly than Claire expected. Every evening after Lily had fallen asleep beneath her favorite patchwork blanket, Claire opened her accounting textbooks at the tiny kitchen table and studied until her eyes could no longer stay open. Coffee replaced sleep more often than she cared to admit, but every completed chapter felt like one small step toward a different future. On a crisp Monday morning in early October, she received an email while folding laundry before work. She had passed the certification exam. Claire read the message twice before covering her mouth with trembling hands. Lily looked up from the floor where she was coloring pictures of autumn leaves. "Mommy, why are you crying?" Claire knelt beside her daughter and smiled through joyful tears. "Because sometimes happy news makes people cry too." Lily wrapped her small arms around her neck without asking another question. For her, that answer was enough. 2 days later, another email arrived. Brooks Financial Services, one of the accounting firms owned by Brooks Capital, invited Claire to interview for a staff accountant position. She stared at the company name for several seconds, feeling both excitement and uncertainty. The salary listed was nearly double what she currently earned working 2 jobs. The benefits included health insurance, retirement contributions, paid vacation, and a schedule that would allow evenings with Lily. It almost felt too good to be real. On the morning of the interview, Claire borrowed a navy blazer from her neighbor, carefully pressed her white blouse, and tied her blonde hair into a neat low ponytail. Before leaving home, Lily looked up at her with wide eyes. "You look like the ladies who work in the big buildings downtown." Claire smiled softly. "Maybe today I will get to work in one." After dropping Lily at school, she rode the train into the financial district, clutching a simple leather folder that held her resume, certification, and years of quiet determination. The lobby of Brooks Financial Services was brighter and larger than any office she had entered in years. Marble floors reflected the morning sunlight, while employees crossed the lobby with confident steps. Claire checked in with the receptionist, who smiled warmly before asking her to wait. Several minutes later, a human resources manager escorted her into a conference room overlooking the skyline. Claire thanked her politely and sat alone, reviewing interview notes one final time. The door opened again. She stood immediately, expecting another recruiter. Instead, Ethan Brooks walked into the room wearing a tailored charcoal suit. For one suspended heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Claire recognized him instantly. The man from the bus. The stranger who had paid for a taxi. The customer from the grocery store. Ethan smiled with the same calm kindness she remembered. "Good morning, Claire." She blinked in disbelief. "You work here?" A faint smile crossed his face. Something like that. Before she could ask another question, the human resources manager returned carrying several folders. She looked at Ethan respectfully. "Everything is ready whenever you are, Mr. Brooks." Claire slowly turned toward him, her expression filled with astonishment. "Mr. Brooks?" The manager looked confused by her surprise. "Yes, he is the founder and chief executive officer of Brooks Capital." Silence settled gently across the room. Claire looked back at Ethan, suddenly replaying every conversation they had shared. He had never mentioned his position. He had never used his influence to impress her. He had simply treated her with quiet respect from the very beginning. Ethan waited until the realization settled before speaking. "Claire, I hope you know this interview is not about gratitude. I did not invite you here because you needed help." He met her eyes with complete sincerity before adding the words that would stay with her for years. "I am not hiring your hardship. I am hiring your character." Claire took a slow breath before sitting down again, still trying to absorb everything she had just learned. The interview that followed felt unlike any she had experienced before. Nobody asked why there was a gap in her corporate career. Nobody questioned why she had spent years working behind cash registers and bakery counters. Instead, they asked how she solved difficult problems, how she balanced priorities under pressure, and what honesty meant to her in the workplace. Claire answered every question with quiet confidence born from real life rather than polished rehearsals. When the meeting ended, Ethan stood and offered his hand. "Thank you for coming today." Claire smiled warmly as they shook hands. "Thank you for seeing more than my resume." 2 days later, while stocking fresh bread during her morning bakery shift, Claire felt her phone vibrate inside her apron pocket. She stepped into the break room before answering the unfamiliar number. The human resources manager greeted her with cheerful excitement. "Congratulations, Claire. We would be honored to welcome you as our newest staff accountant." For a moment, Claire could not speak. She closed her eyes as tears quietly gathered again. "Thank you," she whispered. "I promise you will never regret this." That evening she picked Lily up from school earlier than usual. Instead of rushing to another shift, they stopped at a small neighborhood park where golden leaves drifted gently across the grass. Lily noticed her mother's smile immediately. Did something good happen? Claire knelt beside her daughter and handed her a small paper envelope containing the employment offer. Lily could not understand every word, but she recognized the joy on her mother's face. "Does this mean you will be home for bedtime?" she asked. Claire wrapped her arms around her little girl. "Yes," she answered softly. "Almost every night." Lily smiled so brightly that it seemed to light the entire autumn afternoon. Several months passed. Claire settled naturally into her new position, earning the respect of coworkers through the same humility and kindness she had always carried. She arrived early, stayed organized, encouraged new employees, and never forgot the names of the custodians, receptionists, or cafeteria workers. Ethan watched from a distance with quiet satisfaction. He never treated her differently from anyone else, and Claire never expected special treatment because of how they had met. Their mutual respect grew from shared values instead of circumstance. One rainy evening, after finishing work, Claire chose to ride the city bus home instead of calling a rideshare. As the bus rolled toward the final stops, she noticed a young mother asleep near the back, holding a diaper bag while a tired little boy leaned against her shoulder. Several folded work schedules rested loosely in the woman's lap. The driver announced the final stop, but the young mother never stirred. Claire walked over gently and lowered her voice. "Excuse me," she said with the same kindness once shown to her. "We are at the last stop." The woman woke suddenly, embarrassed and apologetic. Claire smiled reassuringly. "It is okay. We all get tired sometimes." She helped gather the papers that had slipped onto the floor before quietly calling a taxi. When the young mother tried to refuse, Claire smiled and repeated words she would never forget. "A stranger simply noticed another stranger." As the taxi disappeared into the rainy evening, Claire stood beneath the shelter for a moment, remembering another night when her own life had quietly changed because someone had chosen compassion instead of judgment. Far above the city, inside an office where success was once measured only by numbers, Ethan still kept 2 old payroll stubs inside the top drawer of his desk. They reminded him that the greatest investments were never listed on financial statements. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness could earn the greatest return because money could change a person's circumstances, but being seen, respected, and believed in could change an entire life.